today. Good morning, good afternoon. On behalf of my colleagues, Olivia, Montserrat, and Harrison, a big welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for making time to join us for this COP29 briefing. So in this webinar, we will talk about some of the main topics that are going to be on the agenda of COP29. As you know, there are many of them, but time is limited. We only have 1 hour, 45 minutes. There will be 45 minutes of our presentation and then 10, 15 minutes for question and answers. So for this reason, inevitably, we are going to have to focus on some of the key topics which are going to be covered during the meeting in Baku. So next slide, please, Harrison. So as probably some of you know, COP29 has already been labeled the finance COP, and indeed finance, which usually anyway permeates many aspects of these negotiations, is going to be really front and center with expectations that a new quantified goal may be agreed. So we will start with that. One of the other big topic will be reflecting on some of the outcomes of the GST, the global stocktake that took place in December last year, and that is intended to inform NDCs or the climate plans that countries are having to submit by the beginning of next year, as well as the mitigation work program. Adaptation is also a very big topic. There are quite a few items on the agenda, one of which is operationalizing and the global goal on adaptation and further steps that will hopefully be advanced in that area. So we'll cover that. Loss and damage has been, of course, a big topic as well recently, with some institutional changes and developments in the last 2 years. So it'd be interesting to see what next steps are going to happen. Have happened recently and are going to happen at the COP on this, and then we'll finish off with some reflection on just transition and response measures. I will, without further ado, then hand over to Montserrat, who will start us off on the finance. Thank you, Montse.
Thank you, Pascal, and hello, everyone. As Pascal was saying, indeed, COP29 has been labeled as the finance COP, and this is because it's supposed to deliver on a new goal for climate finance, and this is the new Collective Quantified Goal, or the NCQG. Next slide, please, Harrison. So under the UNFCCC regime, the convention and the Paris Agreement as well, developed countries have financial obligations towards developing countries, and this is in order to support the implementation of developing countries' commitments under the convention and the Paris Agreement. This is all grounded in the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So by acknowledging that developed countries are responsible for the bulk of emissions, then they also take the lead in delivering on the implementation of the Convention and the Paris Agreement, and that means not just leading on mitigation, but also providing for finance. So we see here a couple of examples of how these obligations to provide finance to developing countries are reflected in the Convention and the Paris Agreement. We see, for example, that the Convention even goes as far as saying that the implementation by developing countries of their own commitments depends to a certain extent of the effective implementation of finance commitments by developed countries. And the Paris Agreement also reiterates some of these financial obligations. So we still keep this obligation in the new agreement. It doesn't go away. Next slide, please. So these financial obligations are met through multiple means. There are various funds that we will see later in this presentation, but because these are collective obligations concerning developed countries, the process has come up with goals, collective goals, to deliver on a round number of support. So the first goal was established in COP 15 in 2009, and then developed countries committed to jointly mobilize 100 billion US dollars per year. Countries later agreed to extend this goal. When they agreed on the Paris Agreement, they said we're going to extend it for a further period while we agree on a new goal. And so they decided that it would be extended until 2025, and this is, until 2024, and this is why this COP is the one that needs to deliver on a new goal. So when parties decided to extend the previous goal, they also agreed to start a process for it, but it was not until CMA3, the Conference of Members of the Agreement, that took place during COP26 in 2021, that they actually agreed on a process for deliberation. And this process for deliberation takes place between 2022 and 2023, and it consists of a specific ad hoc work program where negotiations mainly take place, which is complemented by technical expert dialogues where parties also meet relevant stakeholders to touch on various elements of the goal. There's also high-level ministerial dialogues acknowledging the need to bring high-level authorities as well into these discussions, stock takes, and then, of course, they take guidance by the CMA. So, for example, the last CMA agreed that now the mode of work needed to be working towards a draft decision in order to ensure that we come to this COP29 with more of a grounded agreement. During 2024, what happened so far is that the second meeting of the ad hoc work program took place during the negotiations in Bonn, where they met 4 times. And for that meeting, the co-chairs presented a draft text as requested, but it was 63 pages long, which made it a bit difficult to engage with. And so the negotiations didn't progress as expected. Then again, also during the Bonn negotiations, one of the technical expert dialogues took place, and then another one later in September. The high-level ministerial dialogue for this year took place in October this year. And additionally, the COP29 presidency facilitated an informal heads of delegation meeting also in October in Baku. And now for the COP, the co-chairs of the ad hoc work program have facilitated a new draft text, which is slimmer. It only has 9 pages this time, and they also offered a report of the work for the CMA. So now we can move on to look at the elements of the goal, and also to engage a little bit with what the draft text is saying at this stage. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so it is for this COP then to agree on the elements of the goal, and that means agreeing on loads. And at this stage, the key elements are still to be agreed, and the developed countries and developing countries are facing sharp divides in modes of them. One of the key elements is, of course, the quantum. So how much is this goal going to be? In order to determine the quantum, it's important to consider developing countries' needs, and for that, it's important to look at bottom-up approaches, which come from NDCs, where parties can outline their needs, but also other communications. There's a report by the Standing Committee of Finance that managed to consolidate the parties' needs as communicated by them, but it could only map 48% of them. So there's still almost half of them that are not costed or budgeted. Another point is the quality. Parties have been discussing over this goal needing to be much more concessional than the previous one, because actually what happened is that it was found that 72% of climate finance is actually debt-based. So developing countries are saying that this goal cannot be the same. It cannot lead countries to further endebtment. So there's also discussion about maybe other potential more innovative sources, not just loans and grants, but maybe taxes, etc. And you can see our literature review on potential sources of funding. Another aspect of quality is, of course, the allocation of finance and the fact that it needs to be accessible and predictable. Another element of the goal that needs to be agreed is its nature and structure. So is it going to be about mobilizing finance, or is it going to be about providing? Is it going to be a single layer goal where there's a single sort of round number of public finance, most likely, which requires to define clearly climate finance, or is it going to be multi-layer? That means a core of public finance, but then maybe private finance in addition to it. And then the allocation, is it going to be structured with sub-goals for mitigation, adaptation, and maybe one for loss and damage, or is it just going to be one pool as it is at the moment? Next slide, please. One of the more crucial elements to agree as well, and where parties are very divided, is on the contributor space. Is it going to change in the sense that are some developing countries going to be included in this contributor space, or is it going to be kept the same, where developed countries are the only ones contributing? And here, of course, developed countries wish to bring some developing countries that contribute to climate change, but developing countries disagree, as they think that this would entail renegotiating the Paris Agreement, since the obligations that I showed you reflect clearly on developed countries. Some other issues where maybe there's more agreement are that this goal needs to provide for transparency and monitoring processes, because the previous one didn't, and therefore it was not adequately met, and also that this goal needs to be flexible in terms of time frame and then being reviewed as needs evolve. Next slide, please. If you want further information, we developed an explainer on the goal, so I'll leave it there for you to have a look at it. Other issues concerning finance, next slide, please. Are set out there, but I will leave it in the presentation so we can move on to the GST and the mitigation work program. But basically, the Adaptation Fund, the Loss and Damage Fund, all of these report and take guidance from the CMA or the COP. So the negotiations are going to be looking at how these funds are working, how much finance is being brought into these funds, and some other aspects are going to be reviewed as well. As Olivia is saying in the chat, the slides will be shared for you to consult and click on all the links as you wish. So the second theme that I want to cover is tell you a little bit about the GST, the NDCs, and the mitigation work program. This process is a lot about acronyms, but we'll outline them for you in the presentation. So next slide, please. So by GST, we are referring to the global stocktake that took place last year, where parties conducted a collective assessment of their efforts towards the implementation of the agreement. That translated into a decision, and this decision captures parties' progress, parties' gaps and challenges as well, and emphasizes the need for urgent action and support in order to keep 1.5 alive. For example, it does call parties to transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems, so it has this strong mitigation message that should inspire the next round of NDCs, because the whole aim of the GST process is that it actually informs the NDCs. Please, the next slide. So during, after this GST took place and during 2024, negotiations have focused on how to conduct this process. So the first negotiation is concerning the the United Arab Emirates GST dialogues that focuses on implementing the GST outcomes. So all of these actions that come out of the decision. And this is supposed to be operationalized now from CMA 6 and conclude at CMA 10 when the next GST is going to take place. But the issue is that because it was established in paragraph 97 of the GST decision, which is the section about finance, parties during the SBs, when they were supposed to agree on the modalities for the dialogue, they encounter that they do not agree on what the dialogue is going to touch, and they do not agree if it should touch on all outcomes of the GST or only the finance-related ones. So this is going to be discussed. Then there's also a second dialogue, second GST dialogue, but it's different. This dialogue is to facilitate the sharing of knowledge on how the outcomes of the GST are informing their next round of NDCs, because the next round of NDCs is coming next year. And finally, there's the GST1 review, which is where parties discuss about the process of the last GST with a view to amend it for the second GST. And this process established it to commence at the SB60, so in June earlier this year, and to conclude at CMA 6, so during COP29. Next slide, please. As I was saying, the GST process is supposed to inform the nationally determined contributions, the next round. So as we know, nationally determined contributions are the driving procedural obligation of the Paris Agreement, where all parties need to submit a commitment, and this is obligatory that this commitment touches on mitigation, while other issues are more voluntary to bring into the NDC. Next slide, please. Because it's going to be submitted now, there's a lot of attention. I mean, next year there's a lot of attention, and we expect that the COP 29 is going to touch on the content of these new NDCs, but especially on how the GST is informing them. So, for example, how are parties taking on this language of transitioning away from fossil fuels? And so this is what we expect will be discussed at the COP. And then finally, in addition to, if we can go to the next slide, please, Harrison. In addition to the GST, there was another process set up to ensure that we drive critical ambition during this decade, and this is the mitigation work program. And so in CMA 4 during COP27, parties agreed on the scope of and the format of the mitigation work program, which basically operates under dialogues. And so there's been 3 dialogues so far, and during the SB60s, parties were invited to share views on these events and on these dialogues, and they found a strong disagreement. Some parties want the mitigation work program to be linked to the GST outcomes, especially in that language that I was telling you about on fossil fuels, whilst others, like the like-minded developing countries and the Arab group, opposed those links. And so the negotiations ended up in Rule 16. That means no agreement, but nevertheless, the co-facilitators produced an informal note and a draft decision, and it is now included in the provisional agenda for SB 60 and SB 61, which take place, for SB 61 and also for SBI 61, both of them taking place during COP 29. So these are the negotiations for these topics. And now I hand it back to Pascal, who is going to talk about adaptation.
Thank you very much, Montse. Yes, I will briefly talk about adaptation and the latest development and what to expect at COP29 on this. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, by way of context, what do we mean by adaptation in the climate change context? We know that the effects of climate change are being already widely observed and experienced across the world. We know that the developing countries are mostly affected by them. So adaptation in layman terms mean coping with the impact of climate change. It also means taking measures to reduce the negative effects of climate change, but also exploit the positive effect by making appropriate adjustments. So these adjustments will be of different nature. They would be economic, social, ecological, etc. Adaptation by its nature is very context specific. There's no one size fits all, and the kind of measures and intervention that needs taking will very much vary from country to country, region and local communities to communities. Adaptation is a topic that has been addressed in the context of the UNFCCC regime, so the climate change regime, already for a long time, but it has kind of been addressed laterally, as it were, because under the convention, the focus was more on mitigation, how to reduce emissions, etc. And so under the Paris Agreement, an article, a dedicated article on adaptation was provided, was set, with the intention of redressing that balance between adaptation and mitigation, which was a key objective and success objective of developing countries, and so success in achieving that. Next slide, please, Harrison. It seems that some of my slide, I can't see the whole of my slide. I was going to, here we are. Thank you. So, as I mentioned already, adaptation has been addressed in the regime since its early days. For the purpose of this presentation, I don't have time to go through it, so I am going to very much focus on the global goal on adaptation, which was provided in Article 7, so in 2015, and I will talk about some of the steps that have been taken in order to operationalize this goal. But if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the background and the context and historical process of the regime, I will signpost you to a pocket guide, an ECBI pocket guide on adaptation, which you will find in our resources at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please, Harrison. So Article 7 does establish a goal on enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. However, this goal, as we can see, does not try to actually quantify the elements that are needed, nor does it contain any kind of qualitative targets. So it was quickly felt that if it was going to remain more than a symbolic goal, it needed to be fleshed out. And so this is what really countries and parties have been negotiating since the adoption of the article and of that goal. Progress has been slow on this, but eventually in Dubai, some concrete progress was made with the adoption of this framework for climate resilience, which is a framework that contains voluntary targets to guide the achievement of the GGA by tracking and measuring progress on adaptation. It includes thematic targets on things such as water, food, agriculture, health, infrastructure, etc., as well as targets set by reference to the iterative cycle of adaptation. What I mean by that is a cycle that refers to the 4 elements of assessing risk and impact, planning for adaptation, implementing adaptation, measuring and reporting on it, etc. The next step then was also in Dubai in 2023 was to establish a 2-year program to develop some indicators to measure progress towards those thematic and dimensional targets, which was going to be carried out under the SubStat and SBI. However, there was still no financial target, and these targets were quite short on detail, particularly in relation to the thematic targets. So some of the work and negotiation that are going on are geared at elaborating on that and fleshing those out. Next slide, please. So what should we expect in relation to the GGA at COP29? So disagreement persists in many areas in relation to, for example, whether to have quantitative and qualitative targets to measure progress, whether to include means of implementation, by which we mean finance, technology transfer and capacity building in this framework, whether the targets should be focused on process-based or whether we should also include outcome-based targets. So quite a lot of still, as you can see, a lot of discussions there to be had. However, we hope that there might be a decision on who will lead on the process for developing these indicators. So there's some disagreement between parties. Some countries, developed countries mainly, wanting the Adaptation Committee to take the lead on that. But others, primarily developing countries, are not so keen on this and want experts to play a big role. And so we will need to have some more clarity on exactly the engagement of these experts in this process and the criteria for identifying these indicators. Another question that will hopefully, with some progress we hope is going to be made at COP29 is what, so the 2-year program that I mentioned, the UAE BILEM work program, is what final output is going to what form will it take place. So some more progress hopefully to be made on that. On the question of means of implementation, there's questions around how do we measure the gaps in finance, technology and capacity building. So again, we hope to have progress on that. as well as the contribution that the GGA will make to the next global stocktake and to future global stocktake, and what the baseline on that might be. We have a few pieces of advice that have delved into some of these questions in relation, for example, to options for the development of indicators and examples taken from other conventions experience. We've also looked at the question of the various bodies, the subsidiary bodies, and the COP powers to create expert group or ad hoc group, and examine also the mandate of the Adaptation Committee in this context and its potential role in developing indicators. So I would, if you're interested, I would recommend that you have a look at that. Thank you, Harrison. I will move on to the next slide now. Very briefly, there will be other items on the agendas of the various bodies which relate to adaptation. I've mentioned here a few. National adaptation plans, which parties are mandated in relation to this to assess progress made towards the formulation and implementation of their NAPs. We know that many countries, in particular developing countries, are facing very substantial challenges with both formulating and implementing their NAPs. So unsurprisingly, at the last meeting in Bonn in June, much of the discussions were focused on access to finance, technology, and capacity building. Some of the discussion as well focused on contribution to adaptation by the private sectors, as well as guiding principles, such as, for example, the contribution that indigenous people can make to this process, the role of gender, and some others. So it is expected that more discussion along those lines will continue at the COP under the SBs. In addition to that, it's expected that the Adaptation Committee will be reviewed, its performance, its effectiveness, and performance will be reviewed at the COP as mandated. Another topic will be around adaptation finance. Monse has mentioned it briefly. So the first global stocktake acknowledged that the funding for adaptation is severely lacking and will need to be significantly increased beyond the doubling provided for in decision 1 CEMA 3 if we want to meet the urgent and evolving need to accelerate adaptation. So more negotiation on this to be expected. Thank you, Harrison. I am now going to briefly talk about loss and damage. Thank you. Next slide, please. So when we talk about loss and damage, what do we talk about? The terms or the expression is not formally defined in the convention or in the Paris Agreement, but is generally understood as the impacts of climate change that cannot be avoided by mitigation or adaptation measures, and is usually recognized as covering slow onset events such as desertification, for example, as well as extreme weather events such as floods, heat waves, etc., etc. And economic, it's also covering economic events, but also non-economic losses and non-economic losses as well. There have been the topic of loss and damage has features in the negotiation since really the early days, or certainly in 2007, but formally since 2007. But a call for it has really been coming from developing countries, and particularly from the group of AOSIS, since the early days of the convention, so of the regime. As you can see here, this slide shows you some of the milestones along the way. Again, for question of time, I'm not going to go into all of it by any means, and I'm going to focus more recent developments. Next slide, please, Harrison. Thank you. So yes, the more recent developments, I'm going to focus, I suppose, more about governance issues and the institutional arrangements that have been developed to address loss and damage. So the first one really is the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, and which has got an executive committee and also the Santiago network. And then separately, I'll talk as well about loss and damage fund and funding arrangements. Next slide, please, Harrison. So the Warsaw International Mechanism was the first vehicle and the main vehicle which was addressed under the UNFCCC process to address loss and damage. At the decision that established it in 2013, also established an executive committee to guide the implementation of the WIM court function. These functions, as you can see, were a lot around enhancing knowledge, understanding of loss and damage, strengthening coordination, dialogue, synergies, etc., among various stakeholders, and enhancing action and support, including finance, technology, capacity building, etc., etc. Thank you, Harrison. Next slide, please. Then the next institution that has been established more recently was the Santiago network. The Santiago network came, in a sense, as a result of the review of the WIM and a recognition that the WIM focus had been on the first two functions and much less so on action and support. And so a call was made to try and address this and have more emphasis on action and support and have a kind of implementation of the WIM. And the result of this was the Santiago network, which was established at COP25 to catalyze technical assistance of organization, bodies, network, etc., for the implementation of loss and damage. The next COP agreed on its function. The following COP agreed on its modalities and its governance with a secretariat, advisory body, and a network of these organizations. Next slide, please. Then the last, really, in looking at the overall governance architecture of loss and damage, the last result of it was the agreement to have some funding arrangement, including a fund for loss and damage. Again, there was the call really for this is a long-standing one by developed countries, and then nearly got it at COP26. But then there was opposition from developed countries, and so we had to wait until another year at COP27 for the establishment of these funding arrangements, including a fund dedicated to loss and damage. The following year, COP28 operationalizes the fund and approves its governing instrument. And the fund, which is now known as the Fund for Responding for Loss and Damage, is thus a multilateral financing channel that aims to assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effect of climate change in responding to loss and damage, with a focus on addressing loss and damage by providing and assisting in mobilizing new and additional resources. The fund is going to be provisionally hosted by the World Bank, And at the last meeting of the board of the fund, it was agreed that all the trustees arrangement and the hosting agreement for the World Bank were agreed. So a big result in some ways, but as Montse alluded to already, some big questions really, similar question to those under the NCQG still remain. For example, who will be the recipient of this fund? Will it be particular vulnerable countries or all developing countries, but with a priority for developing countries? Can high-income developing countries access it? What form will the funding take? Will it take the form of grant or loan? That will then exacerbate again the debt burden of countries. Who will be the contributors? Will it be industrialized nation, high-income developing countries? And will it be mandatory for both, or mandatory for industrialized nation, but voluntary for high-income developing countries? So really big questions still to be decided in really the years ahead. So this is not all going to be decided here at the COP. Next slide, please, Harrison. So yes, very briefly, the next, so at the COP, what can we expect in relation to those three bodies and in the institution? In relation to the WIM, the third review of the WIM is to be expected, and the terms of reference for these third reviews have been prepared in Bonn, and they will cover the WIM performance and review the WIM performance and function. It will also review its structure, bearing in mind that it has got this executive committee, but also Santiago network. It will also review progress in implementing the activities and the links and the synergies between these and the loss and damage fund. The one other possible topic that will be raised will be the consideration of the WIM governance, because the WIM is under the under the COP, but is also serves the Paris Agreement, and is also, and as a result, is under the authority and guidance of the CMA. So it's not quite clear to the extent to which the COP governance has been superseded by the CMA or not, and so consideration of that question might continue. The ExCom is supposed to annually report to the COP, so it will do that as well. In relation to the Santiago network, the advisory board met 3 times this year. It decided on a number of things, such as headquarters location in Geneva, its work program, an indicative budget, and guidelines on various things, as you'll see here, how it will respond to requests to assistance, manage funding, conflict of interest, etc. It's also expected that the advisory board will recommend its draft rule of procedure for adoption by the COP and the CMA, and it will, like the executive committee of the WIM, it is supposed to now annually report to the COP and CMA, so it will be doing that too. Next slide, and this is my last slide, I think. In relation to the fund for responding to loss and damage, so this year, the board of the fund met 3 times, and it's meant to meet again in December. And it started the process of operationalizing the fund and the funding arrangements. At the last meeting, the board appointed the executive director of the Secretariat, and as I said, approved all the documentation that will allow the World Bank to act as interesting trustee. The 4th board meeting will really start on the crunch issue of the design of the fund and its modalities on such things as direct access and direct budget support, fiduciary standards and environmental and social safeguard for direct access entities, minimum allocation floor for LDCs and SIDS. So really big questions there that will be discussed. At the COP itself, what can we expect? Two things. There will be on the margin of the World Leader Summit, Climate Summit, there will be the launch of an annual high-level dialogue on coordination and complementarity with representative of the entities that form part of the funding arrangements. And then there will be also, hopefully, the contractual arrangement between the COP, the CMA, and the fund to ensure that it is accountable and function under the guidance of the COP and the CMA will be approved. I will leave it at that. And pass on to Olivia to talk about just transition and response measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal. And I'll finish this this webinar with two topics that have been coming up in prominence, and I'll try and do my best to keep it short because I'm sure there will be questions, and I want to make sure we have time to tackle those. Next slide, please. Or have I changed the slide already? Okay, we are already on the introduction slide. Perfect. So just transition comes in the negotiations under two separate streams, under a kind of well-established, long-standing item on response measures, and I will delve into that after. The first I'm going to focus on is under the recently created Just Transition Work Programme. So the Just Transition Work Programme, or for yet another acronym, JTWP, it was established in Egypt in 2022. And the objective of this work programme is to discuss pathways to achieve the Paris Agreement goals under a just and equitable transition. For some reason, countries felt they couldn't discuss this, or they couldn't take forward maybe a more comprehensive understanding of just transition than under the response measures work stream. But this is still kind of open, and we are unsure as to the exact reason for this. But we are here now in 2024. Last year, the Just Transition Work Programme was further developed. So we now know that it operates by having a contact group at each of the meetings of the subsidiary bodies. It has 2 annual dialogues and also an annual high-level ministerial roundtable. And we have core elements of this work program that have come from the decision last year in Dubai that tells us a little bit about what it is going to be centered. So there is just transition pathways, as was mentioned already, but also kind of dimensions of these pathways. For example, energy, socioeconomic, workforce, etc. Opportunities and challenges and barriers that relate to sustainable development and poverty eradication, as well as approaches to enhancing adaptation, and so on. So as you can see, this is quite a broad remit, which is reflective of the fact that different parties have different views of what they want just transition, of what they mean by just transition, and what they want the program to be about. And they have different priorities as a result as well as to in country what the just transition is going to entail for them. So it has been quite difficult to try and bring all those views together and continue to provide guidance for a program to be more fleshed out, because at the moment it means so many things to many different people. So this year, what we've had so far 2 dialogues, and there's an informal summary from the first dialogue that's available that was concentrating on achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement through NDCs, NAPs, so National Adaptation Plans, and LT-LEDs, which are the long-term low emission development strategies. There was a recent one in October, and we don't have the informal summary of that yet, but this will have been an occasion already for countries to not only share experiences and learn from one another, but to share more of their views of what the program is like. There was in Bonn at the subsidiary meetings sessions, discussions on a draft decision text to further implement this work program, but no agreement. So this is going to continue at the next subsidiary meeting, which will be happening during the COP in November. And so what we expect will be the main sort of discussions will be centered around sort of the annual summary report of the dialogues, because obviously everyone will want their views to be captured, yet it has to be a summary. There will be obviously the negotiations on the further implementation, so this decision that's expected, and the annual high-level ministerial roundtable will take place. And just here some key issues and a flag that we have an upcoming explainer on the just transition that should be published really soon. So to watch out on our social media and our website and our newsletters. But in terms of the key issues, there is obviously the informal note from the June meeting that details some of the country's positions, though it's not consensus. And otherwise, what we know is already the fact that just transition is a concept, and the lack of definition and lack of agreement that we need to define this in the process already is problematic. Furthermore, how to continue the work of this work program, whether to include just transition as part of other constituted bodies' work is up as well. And some parties, a proposal from G77 plus China was made to establish a work plan, so to have more concrete actions over a set period of time, because the work program is just very broad and thematic. But this is opposed by the US, so we'll see how that goes ahead. And also the modalities, whether we need to have more dialogues or more meetings or different ways to implement this work program. And last but not least, the response measures, which I mentioned is a bit more long-standing. So what do we mean, first of all, by response measures? So response measures are mainly understood by the measures that countries take to reduce emissions. And under all of the treaties in the climate regime, so the Convention, Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, the fact that implementing response measures will impact on countries' economies is recognized. And in order to better understand these impacts and address them, countries then set up a forum, and it was complemented a few years later in 2018 by a Katowice committee, or KCI, I'm not going to say the full name, which is created to support the forum's work. So the KCI is much smaller, I think about 16 or 18 members at the moment, and it undertakes technical work, which the forum can do because it really provides a space for all the parties to come together. And both of these are a single platform for all the agreements on the issue of response measures. And already here we can see that there is going to be and there is a clash between response measures and the Just Transition Work Program, because also under the response measure work stream, one of the areas of the work program of the forum is to look at just transition of the of the workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs. So perhaps this will remain, or it will be reviewed. It's something that's being discussed. But what we have on the plate for this year, what we've had so far, we've had 2 technical events, and countries started to develop the new 5-year work plan of the forum and the KCI. In this context, some countries have expressed the view that maybe it's not longer necessary to include just transition under the work of the KCI. So what will be coming up during the COP as part of the subsidiary bodies meeting is that, first of all, there is going to be an item where the KCI needs to consider updating its rules of procedure. And furthermore, the forum will obviously continue to develop its work plan and hopefully agree to a work plan that it can recommend to the different treaty bodies to adopt formally. So that's response measures, and we just wanted to flag that there's many more agenda items on the agendas of the treaty bodies that we haven't had time to cover in today's session. Maybe you will have heard about, Article 6 and the carbon markets being quite prominently on the agenda because no consensus was reached at the last meeting in Dubai at the COP last year. And so that's kind of high on the agenda for this year, but there's others as well. And you have resources and the link there to the UNFCCC website where you can find all the provisional agendas and more details on the status of negotiations and updates on all the work streams that we couldn't go into in our SB60 outcomes summary for you. Thank you very much. And I haven't kept track of the Q&A, but hopefully if Harrison you have, or if you have a question you haven't put in the chat and would like to raise it, please raise your hand. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, as Olivia just mentioned, please do put them in the Q&A or raise your hand and we can activate your mic. Millie Thomas, you should be able to activate your mic.
Hi, thanks guys. Thanks, that was an amazing presentation and very full, thorough. So thank you very, very much. I was wondering if you guys have a sense of what a success at this COP might look like. Obviously, there are lots of key things on the agenda, and successful at different for each of them. But broadly, as we think about the decision that might come out of it at the end, what to your mind would be a good one?
I'm not sure who would like to take that on the team.
Pascal, Montse, maybe you could both have your cameras on and we can coordinate, but I think, yeah, I'm thinking finance.
Finance, as Montse mentioned, finance and agreeing on this new quantified goal will be really very crucial, and it's really important in many respects. One, because yes, the needs are very much there, but it's also a question of trust ultimately, and it's a question of credibility of the process, and so some agreement on that would be key. The other big one, I think it's around NDCs and the ambition of NDCs. We only saw last week the latest UNEP report, GAP report, that indicates that we are very far from the trajectory that we need to be in order to remain within a safe temperature, global warming pathways. So, and that the next round of NDCs need to be much more ambitious than they already are, and of course need to be implemented. So it's a question of submitting the ambitious NDCs, but then countries, of course, following up on their ambition and by implementing them and taking all the measures necessary at domestic level. I'll leave it at that. Maybe Monsieur Olivia, if I've got other suggestions.
No, not from my side, but just on that point on the NDC's implementation, and because I couldn't say that in the presentation, the NDCs are not sort of enforceable in the process, but they are at the domestic level. So that's something where national governments also should pay attention to the implementation of their own commitments, and in order to rebuild this trust into the process that is much needed.
Thank
Thanks
you,
both.
Pascal. And
Are there any more
Montserrat.
questions?
We are just at time, so we have got time for 1 or 2 more questions if there are any, but if not.
Just perhaps to say that, as you see, if you would like to follow up with a question, whether it is on the presentation or whether it is about something else to do with the upcoming COP, you have our email address, contact details, etc. So, of course, do not hesitate to contact us. We're going to be there for the whole duration of the COP, and we will have some volunteers, lawyers, as well as our experts to support us. So do reach out to us if need be. We have also shared some resources, and as Olivia said, look at as well on our social media. We've got some new explainers as well as update to existing explainers on the NCQG, on loss and damage, that are going to be that are in the process of being finalized. So look out for those, and we'll bring a few hard copies with us at the COP as well. So unless there are any burning questions, I think we are going to probably close now. But thank you very much all for listening. And we wish you, if you're planning to attend the COP, if you're preparing for it, we wish you all the best in your preparation, and of course wishing you productive negotiations, and hope to meet you in Baku in less than 2 weeks. Thank you.